Well, some of the highlights, I would say basically, I decided to study the 12 apostles with Matthias instead of Judas, and then James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, because they're such significant figures in the early church, and they're both eyewitnesses of Jesus, and both not believers in Jesus during their lifetime. And I think we can conclude with confidence that at least James, the brother of Jesus, James, the son of Zebedee, Peter, and Paul, we have good historical evidence that they died as martyrs. I think a decent case can be made for Thomas and for Andrew. I think the rest, to be honest with you, it's hard to know when history ends and when legend begins. We just don't know. For example, the story is that Bartholomew was skinned alive. This is the tradition we often hear. Well, the earliest record that I could find is about 500 AD. Now, that doesn't mean it's false, but historically speaking, we can't have much confidence in that being true. Not to mention, when it comes to Bartholomew, there's a number of different traditions about where he went and how he died, about 5, 6, 7 different traditions.
Right.
So I'm looking at this saying, I don't think historically speaking, we can have a lot of confidence that Bartholomew died that way.
Right.
So when I ratcheted it back, I said, okay, what really matters here? I said, well, the first thing is we have good, early, consistent evidence that the apostles were eyewitnesses of Jesus. That's why they believed. We see it in all 4 Gospels. We see this distinctly in Paul's writings, like 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We see it in extra biblical writings. Church fathers like Clement of Rome and Ignatius talking about that. So very early, the consistent record is the apostles saw with their own eyes.
Right.
Second, we know at the heart of their faith was the resurrection. There is no early Christian faith apart from belief in the resurrection. There's some critics who will say, in the 2nd century, this resurrection begins to emerge, but it wasn't at the heart. Well, this just simply isn't true. The earliest account we have in 1 Corinthians 15, which is at least 2 decades after the death of Jesus. And I think he's passing on a creed that he received earlier, probably within 3 to 5 years of the death of Jesus. Paul says, I pass on you what was most important, that Jesus died, he was buried, he rose on the 3rd day. The early, consistent testimony is that to be a Christian was to believe in the resurrection. I mean, read the book of Acts. When they start proclaiming and preaching the message of Jesus, it's about the resurrection. So the Gospels are eyewitnesses. Second, we know that they were proclaiming the resurrection. Third, we see persecution. I decided to read through the New Testament and pay attention to every single book when either somebody was persecuted or Jesus taught that someone would be persecuted for their faith. I was stunned and partly disappointed how much I had missed this before. At the heart of Jesus' message is pick up your cross and follow me.
Right.
Now, sometimes we say, pick up your cross. My neighbor listens to loud music. My son is disobedient. Well, that's not what he meant. He meant pick up your cross and be ready to die. It's over Paul's writing. It's over James' writing. It's in Hebrew, this consistent message. You proclaim Jesus, persecution is coming. But then we see this outside of the church in writings like Tacitus and in Pliny the Younger, that when people proclaim the message of Jesus publicly, they were persecuted. So if we take a step back, what does this tell us? You have a group of people who believe they had seen the risen Jesus. The first thing they proclaim is the resurrection. We have reason to believe that if people were proclaiming the resurrection, persecution was very likely. And then we look at the individual apostles. What do we find? We find some good evidence for Peter. 1st century evidence that he died as a martyr. Same for Paul. And I think same for both James. So the key is not so much that we can show that all of the apostles died as martyrs. The key is that they sincerely believe that Jesus was risen from the grave and were willing to suffer and die.
And
That's the key.
And it's compelling. I mean, it's not like a leap of logic that if you can pretty much corroborate that, that at least a handful of them, you can see they did die as martyrs, then it's not unreasonable to suggest that the other ones could have also.
Yeah, I think the key is to argue this. You look in the book of Acts, chapter 4 and 5, the apostles start proclaiming the risen Jesus. They're threatened, they're beaten, they're thrown in prison. We see Stephen killed in the early chapters of Acts. We see James killed in Acts 12 too. And they're told, just stop proclaiming the risen Jesus. In Acts 5, Paul basically says we can't. We fear God more than we fear men. So the earliest record we have is this group of men proclaiming they'd seen the risen Jesus, willing to suffer and die and face persecution for that belief. We have no record any of them recanted, and we know with confidence that at least some of them died as martyrs.
Right.
So this doesn't prove the resurrection is true, but it tells us they didn't make it up. They were sincere.
Yep.
They didn't invent this false story to get themselves persecuted and to lose everything. They really believed Jesus had risen from the grave and appeared to them.
So with that now, it's a great area of focus to, to say, let's go deep here and see what does exist in the way of information around this and evidence. What other things about the resurrection do you feel like is very compelling as far as saying that the resurrection is validated?
Well, I think we have to go step by step and look at the facts that we know. So sometimes people start and say, we've got to defend the entire Bible being true, and then you get the resurrection thrown in.
Right.
Well, I think we can make a case from archaeology, from manuscripts, etc., that the Bible and the New Testament and the Gospels are reliable documents. But we can also say, let's just look at this event, the resurrection, through the lens of how we would look at any event in history. See what facts we know are true, and ask what conclusion best explains it. So there's a few things we know. Did Jesus die? Well, that's unmistakable. We have medical evidence that blood and water came out, that John reports, which only happened, we can medically show at the point of death. We have it multiple attestation in all the Gospels, the writings of Paul, writings of Peter. We even have Josephus and Tacitus, extra biblical writers talking about Jesus dying. So Jesus died on the cross. Then we have this amazing evidence for an empty tomb. One piece of fact being that it was discovered by women. I find this very fascinating. If you're the apostles and you're making up in that culture a story based on a resurrection in which a woman's testimony was not valued as highly as a man's testimony. In fact, the more significant an event was, the less likely they would rely upon a woman. So you're the apostles, and you're inventing a story based upon a historical event. Who's the least likely people you would invent? Well, it's obvious, women.
Right.
So why do they all report, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that women found the tomb? Because that's what they really believed happened. They weren't inventing this story. Then you have all these cases of appearances. You have appearances of the 500 in 1 Corinthians 15. You have appearances to the apostles. You have appearances again to the women. You have appearances to skeptics like Thomas, James, and Paul. And then you have this transformation of the apostles, willing to suffer and die for this. Tells me they didn't make this up. We have good, consistent early evidence that Jesus rose from the grave. Now, other people might say, okay, here's other theories that can explain the resurrection.
Right.
And you just Google this, you'll find endless hypotheses. But the question always has to be, given certain facts that we know, what theory best explains all of them and has the least problems? So probably the most common one is that the apostles hallucinated. Well, one big problem with that is hallucinations are internal subjective feelings.
Right.
There's not an external object that matches up with them. Well, we have multiple accounts of group appearances of Jesus. I mean, you can no more share hallucination than you can a dream.
Right.
So hallucinations have a hard time accounting for the facts. It also can't really account for the empty tomb. Another common one, which really rocked me in high school, I grew up in a Christian home, and I heard that the Bible is true. I always believed it. And then I heard these skeptics who wrote these articles that said maybe Jesus didn't exist. Maybe Christianity is patterned after these dying and rising gods, Mithras and Horus and Adonis and Isis from, kind of the ancient world at that time. And there's nothing unique about Christianity. I'd never heard that before. And it rocked me intellectually and emotionally to think, what if the story isn't true? When I started to look into it, I realized that there's a few huge problems with this. Number one, the dating is all wrong. So some of these stories existed before the time of Christ, but any of the parts of the stories that closely mirror Christianity tend to come from the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. So if there's any borrowing going on, it's from them borrowing from Christianity rather than the other way around. Second, you'll see similar terms, but what they mean by these terms are very different. So last time I looked, it's been a little while, on Wikipedia, it said that Osiris resurrected. Well, that sounds like Jesus resurrected, Osiris resurrected. Well, if you read the story of Osiris, he's murdered, thrown into a chest, falls in the bottom of the sea, body is put back together, and eventually becomes god of the underworld. That's not a resurrection. It's the same word, but it doesn't have the same meaning. Besides, these are fictional stories that are patterned after the dying and rising of the seasons, not historical events like we have with the person of Jesus. There's many other naturalistic hypotheses that people put in, but none of them can account for the facts that we know with as much consistency and power as the resurrection.
So what do you think right now is the biggest, or some of the bigger misconceptions about Christianity that non-Christians or the non-Christian world has a certain view of Christianity from the outside, looking from the outside in as compared to from the inside out? What do you think is some of the mischaracterizations that are erroneous?
I think of a few. I think, number one, people look and say, well, look at all the bloodshed and the horror and atrocities done in the name of Christ. That's a common misconception. Now, certainly some bad things have been done by people who say that they are believers and by the church. I'm not denying that, but that's the lens by which people see all of Christianity. They miss, number one, all the good that's been done in the name of Christ: hospitals, universities, orphanages, women's rights, etc. And people also fail to distinguish between when people do things that goes against what Jesus taught. Clearly they're violating the way Jesus told people to live. So I do think a lot of people look at Christianity through that lens, which I don't think is the whole picture. I think another one, people look at Christianity and just think, as with any religion, it's all a matter of faith. It's just blind faith. Just believe it if it works for you. And they don't realize that Christianity is based upon a testable historical event. I think the other one is, a first question in many people's minds today is not so much, is Christianity true, but is Christianity good? I think we live in a culture, given certain moral norms that have been broadly accepted, in particular related to the issue of sexuality. Christians are bigoted, they're hateful, they're intolerant. So many people won't even consider the evidence because they look at Christians, or at least the perception of Christians that's proclaimed to them, and they think, why would I want to be like that? So they don't even entertain the evidence.
Right.
Those are three big pushbacks that I tend to see.
Thanks so much for being here and watching that video. And can I ask you to please subscribe to our channel so you can find out when we're posting new content. You'll be alerted right away when we do. To share this with people you think might benefit from the information, and certainly it helps us if you like the video. So if you like what you just saw, go ahead and hit that like button. And again, thank you so much for being here with me right now.